It was a big week. The speech is over. Impeachment is over. Iowa, somehow, incredibly, is not over. May never be over. And Nancy Pelosi, the media's new master politician, the smartest woman in the world who took Hillary Clinton's place on that score, her party seems to be in disarray.
Well, those are big stories for This Week in Common Sense for the first week of February 2020. Now, I am not Paul Jacob. I'm Timothy Virkala, but I'm going to try to cut myself out of most of this. And Paul just talked about the big stories of the week that took place in the middle of the week. But he began with discussion of Britain. Do you want to start with the big stories, or are you going to go back to Britain?
Well, I think we'll get to all of that, but maybe Britain first, because although the first of the week we talked about Brexit, because last week Brexit really got finalized. Nigel Farage had a very strong speech to the European Union, stating their case and so on, and so that was kind of how it started. And as we pointed out on Monday, you have to kind of see, where is Britain going to go? Brexit could be a great thing, or it could be kind of a rotten thing if Britain decides it wants to be protectionist. Britain decides it wants to tie up its economy with all kinds of socialistic controls and systems and incentives. We pointed out Britain really led the way in free trade and made itself very, very wealthy in the process. Not signing off on any of Britain's colonial activities. Some of those revolutions, particularly one across the pond, was really, I think I'm going to put words in your mouth, Tim, was one of the greatest things that ever happened. So, but by the end of the week, I witnessed on one program, and I can't remember which one it was right off the bat, but they got to discussing Brexit and Britain and just the implosion of the Labour Party. Jeremy Corbyn and his complete and utter disaster of a campaign. And one columnist had written a piece about Britain and comparing it to what's happening with the Democratic Party going so far to the left. Trump seemed to be incredibly vulnerable with over 50% negative, 60% at one point during the campaign in 2006 against Hillary Clinton. Well, she had big negatives. That's why he was able to somehow eke out a win, picking up 3 states that in the Rust Belt that Republicans just don't ever pick up. And now, of course, it looks like, well, with those big negatives, with impeachment and Russiagate and just, the whole saga that has been the Trump administration, still with very high negatives, low approval ratings, then the Democrats have their pick and they're going to whoop him come November 2020. And yet it sure seems to be the one person was arguing, no, the U.S. isn't like Britain here, and argued that the U.S. is probably more following what's happening in Mexico. I think the U.S. is a lot like Britain, and the more this guy was saying the opposite, the more I thought, that I think that is certainly a very plausible way to look at how our election is shaping up. And obviously, people can always change what they're doing, what they're saying. Events can change, and so to predict that, we're going to be just like Britain, that doesn't make it happen. But I certainly think that the steps that are being taken, the way that the Democratic Party has moved to the left under Trump's time in the White House is has created a situation where I think he's the odds-on favorite to win re-election. And I just have I never thought he would win. I always thought it was possible because of the way, because of the fact that the country's been crying for an anti-establishment candidate, and he seemed to become that and got a narrow path to victory. But then after he was elected, I never thought this guy's going to get reelected. And I still think it's, certainly a close call. But increasingly, it looks like he may be reelected. And the reason will be in the same way as the United Kingdom, that the Labour Party, or here the Democratic Party, moves so far to the left that the American people say, look, the economic times are good. We're not a fan, at least a lot of us aren't a fan of Mr. Trump and his persona, but his policies may be better than the other guy and or gal, and Americans can make that decision just like the Brits can, and I think they will if the Democrat isn't someone who they see as a pro-capitalism, reasonable person. And of course, it's interesting. The 800-pound gorilla in the wings is Mayor Bloomberg, and he's the reasonable alternative. The problem is he's not very reasonable. A guy who not only will grab your gun, but isn't so sure you can order a big gulp at the local convenience store without his approval. This guy is not exactly, the Mr. Mainstream. And in fact, the only thing that Bloomberg has going for him in my book, and you have to remember, those of you who remember years ago when he was mayor, he barely won a third term as mayor, having spent millions. I believe he spent somewhere in excess of $100 million on his mayoral campaign in New York. And granted, New York's an expensive city, but it's a city. He spent $138 a vote to win barely against a guy who was underfunded, who had almost no chance. Nobody ever thought he had a chance. And Bloomberg barely beat him. And the reason is because Bloomberg ran for office initially pledging to protect against the council that kept trying to get out of their term limits, that the liberal people of New York said, we love term limits. And then when they tried to get out, they voted again saying, no, we're keeping the term limits as they are. It's not a liberal or conservative issue. San Francisco, New York City, Washington, D.C. has voted for him. Almost every major city that's had a chance to vote for him has voted for him. And so do all the conservative places. People understand we need term limits. Well, Mayor Bloomberg, candidate Bloomberg said, I not only support these term limits, I pledge to protect the city against the council's attempts to undo them, because New York City's initiative process is stupidly drafted. The whole reason to have an initiative process is for people to say, hey, we're the boss. We understand you want to run our lives, but it's America. Citizens are in charge. We're going to do it our way. And to have the final word. In New York City, even after you pass an initiative, the council has the final word and can rip it up and repeal it or change it any way they want with a simple majority vote. Outrageous. That should be changed. But of course, someone has to do it, and the council might rip that up. But Bloomberg pledged to be the guy who would stop that. Instead, Bloomberg was the guy, when it came time for him to be through with his 2 terms, to get the council and collude with them to get his 3rd term. And the people of New York were so disgusted with him that even though he had all the money, he was running against the sacrificial lamb nearly beat him in the election. So I don't like Mayor Bloomberg day one. That was even before he was, well, actually, maybe it was after he did some of his other things, but the big gulp, hey, New Yorkers can't decide how much soda they drink. That's just way too much freedom. He also was a stop and frisk guy. And, that's kind of seen as that's something a conservative would do. Well, Bloomberg's no conservative. And I don't know where conservatives are on that, but if conservatives are for that, that clearly is one of the places where I'm a libertarian and I separate from conservatives. because if you have reason to suspect someone has committed a crime, yes, the police have probable cause and can and maybe should stop that person and take action. And if they don't find anything, of course, they would let that person go. But you better have probable cause. You can't just decide you don't like the way someone looks or they came from a part of town that you think is higher crime than another part of town, which the charge is always gets to be a racial stop. We don't even have to get to the racism of it. It violates the First Amendment or the Fourth Amendment protection against that type of search. And if you do it to one person, not just as a policy across the board, for heaven's sakes, you do it to one person, you should be called on the carpet. When you do it as a policy, that is outrageous. And that they were not sued on that policy sooner and stopped sooner is a travesty. The other thing about Mr. Bloomberg is he's never come to grips and been honest about that. He's sort of said he's sorry about it and then made some comment about, boy, if I just would have known or something. Well, of course he knew. It was in the news and so on. He acted as if somehow he found out after the fact, and boy, he would have not wanted to do that if he would have known that there were problems with it. Well, he knew there were problems with it. So it's I'm not a big fan of Mr. Bloomberg. The interesting thing for me, if he ends up becoming, even gets into the fight and climbs to where he's the alternative to Sanders or whoever's on the liberal wing, or maybe it's Buttigieg in him. But I think you're going to see someone on the liberal end and someone on the more moderate end. And of course, the more moderate end is about 70 zillion light years to the left of where it used to be. But anyway, but if you see that, you're going to see the ultimate billionaire candidate. And would the Democrats, the folks that have just made it to where, boy, if you're successful financially, something must be wrong with you. You know, we really ought to kind of punch you a couple times and steal some of your stuff right now, just to begin the evening up process. It's, you know, it just reminds you of like the Cultural Revolution without the class, you know, without the decency and sentimentality. No, it is. It's dangerous for people to talk about successful people, the 1%, in the demonizing way that this country has as a society, you know, whatever the hell that means. But you know what it means. And you see it all the time. For us to talk about successful people that way, day after day after day for years, is a really dangerous situation. And I think we ought to treat it more that way than we do. Of course, all week we were in and out of, you know, we had the State of the Union, first we had Iowa, which was just an incredible debacle. And we'll get to that when we get later in the week. We did the Blue Plate special, but we also had the State of the Union, which was one of the strangest State of the Unions ever. And in my thinking, it was everything I don't like about a State of the Union on steroids, even though I think Trump was very, very effective from a communication standpoint, doing it the way that really turned me off. But then also on Wednesday, you had his acquittal. And it was a little bit funny. And I'm just skating all around, and we'll go back here in a second to talk about ex-Californians. But when I woke up and looked at my Washington Post on Thursday morning, it said Trump acquitted. And I thought, oh my goodness, that's the best headline Trump has ever gotten in the Washington Post. That was my first thought. And my wife commented on it as well that morning. And then, of course, later that day, Trump's holding it up, or not probably, I don't know what time the prayer breakfast was, but holding it up at the prayer breakfast. So it is, as much as I thought he took kind of a gauche, caddish, insensitive, obnoxious, arrogant victory lap, which I'm sure a lot of people who were supporters liked, because, you know, they'd had to take some stuff, but a bad idea. victory laps are just really not that necessary. Celebrate in the clubhouse where no one sees you and everyone thinks that, boy, was that person a good winner. That's not Trump, though. But anyway, it was interesting that he held that newspaper up in that way, because that was actually the response I had to the headline is that's the best headline he's ever going to get in the Washington Post. So let's talk a little bit about ex-Californians. We talked about ex-Californians because there are people in Idaho and in Texas and other places who are a little bit concerned that there are too many people moving in from California. And they're concerned in that way that people are funny. We will sometimes not like where we are, which is good. And not good, but you know what I mean. We realize we don't like it. That's a good thing, because then we can change it and we decide to move somewhere else where we think things are going to be better. And oftentimes it's economic causes. We don't have a job, maybe, where we like living here, but we don't have a job or any money. And that really undercuts the positives of a place, I have found personally. And, each his own, but that's my read on those things. And so we move somewhere else where the economic opportunities are better. And then, of course, we want to maybe change that new place where the economic opportunities are better to resemble the place we just moved from, where the economic opportunities are not as good. And sometimes the people in those new places we've moved to think, now, wait a second, I don't want my place to be like that place you just moved from that doesn't have any economic opportunity. So anyway, that's a legitimate concern for people. Obviously, people have freedom of movement in our country and should, but really interesting. And one of our fairly regular commenters, Rick Rund, who I've really enjoyed his comments. Well, it turns out, he says, we are those ex-Californians of which you speak, and points out that, it is a real problem in California that it's such a large state, which of course was one of the points we made, is it would be very legitimate to break up California if Californians want to do that. And it leads me to, at the end of the week, we actually had some stories in the paper. In fact, you sent me a link to a story, and I had seen an earlier story on it a couple of weeks ago, but they had taken it even further, and that was West Virginia's governor. There had been some counties in West Virginia inviting counties on the border in Virginia to join them. And of course, these counties left during the Civil War. And so that's how West Virginia got formed. And they're saying, hey, so, some of your counties came very close to voting to move over then. Why don't you move over now? Well, here's the governor of West Virginia saying, hey, we welcome you to come over. Now, I think for the most part, people, as was said by Mr. Jefferson and his editors at the Continental Congress, 1776, people are unlikely to change their circumstances unless there's really a serious problem with their circumstances. A lot of cost to changing to a new state or moving across the country or, heaven forbid, across the world. Exciting, but a lot of costs involved. And so, people don't change their circumstances. People don't revolt against the government the first time there's ever a problem. He was very right about that. But that could happen. And one of the things we have continually talked about is things like the state of Jefferson. Those are the northern counties. I think it's 19 counties or something, and maybe 16. I could be totally wrong. Don't believe me. If you're writing a term paper, don't cite me, please. But it's the counties in Northern California, which is a huge land area and has the needs and the problems of a place where huge land, not that many people. But of course, it's governed completely without much representation, at least that matters, because it's governed by people who live in San Diego and LA and San Francisco and San Jose and Sacramento. And, those are millions and millions and millions and millions of people. And it might want to leave. In fact, I think the people of that area would vote to leave California and form a different state. And of course, that has all the implications of U.S. senators and so on. So in the same way that a lot of conservatives don't think, and I happen to agree with them, that Washington, D.C. should be its own separate state with 2 senators, there may be some qualms with people saying, well, that's going to be a conservative state because it's more rural, at least presently, politically. And so those 2 senators are going to be Republican senators. There may be all sorts of political negotiations that go on. However, at the base of it, if the people who live in the area that they call Jefferson, that's the new state they want to leave California and form their own state, if there is a solid majority of people and that's what they want, that's what they ought to get. If those counties on the border say, we want to move to West Virginia, and I think already with the gun laws and other things, the Democrats in Richmond have gone too far. I don't want those counties to leave because I'm not in those counties. And then that makes the state's going to be more blue and less competitive. And so, and truth is, whether it's red or blue, competitive is the best of all situations. And we've written scripts through the years, as you'll recall, Tim, oftentimes pointing out to people that you think you're going to get lower spending Republicans because you elect a Republican president and a Republican Congress. The evidence is that is not going to be the case. That if you want less spending, you want a divided government, whether it's a Democrat in the White House or a Republican in the White House and a Democrat Congress, you're going to get less spending if they're split. And my sense is, historically, and it was just a sense, I could be wrong, don't put this in your term paper, I think that the Democrat president and the Republican Congress, probably the best situation was Clinton, even though they spent a lot more money than they should have spent. I mean, Clinton would kind of say, I want to spend this, and Congress say, no, this, and then they negotiate, and it would go higher. But because there was that kind of rough given, pushback on both sides, the American people got a little bit less spending. And of course, Bill Gates and Steve Jobs and about 7 zillion other people who worked their tail off during that decade produced a lot of economic growth, which made all the mistakes Clinton and the Republican Congress were making less onerous to the rest of us. But the bottom line is this. It's when people talk about Hong Kong, the people of Hong Kong aren't saying we want to be separate and so on. Now, I think if they thought they could be, they'd vote for it in a Hong Kong minute. But that's not what they're saying. They're saying we want certain rights. But if they were saying that, if they were saying we want to be separate from China, we might all go, China's very big and they've got an army and you don't. This is going to be very difficult. But they have every right to it. Every right to it. When Catalonia wants to break away from Spain, you might say, and the truth is, if there's an election, I'm not sure that a majority of Catalonians would vote to separate from Spain. I think it'd be a close election. It might not be the situation in which I personally think, hey, this is a good move. But it's not up to me. It's not up to you unless you're a Catalonian. And it's in all of these situations, we should be consistent and we should let people have self-determination. And then we should take that concept, because it's the right concept, just as far as we can take it. When people look at, even when we've had conscription in our country, and look at how early on there was a certain respect in the law and in the execution of the law on conscription, on other things, for religious objectors, for where people realized this is a problem for this group of people. And we know that it is a heartfelt problem, and they'll go to great lengths because they have a religious fervor that this is the right thing to do. That's not someone you want to aggress against. That's what respect is all about. We argue these days about whether somebody's shooting off their mouth with a bunch of 4-letter words and so on some Facebook post, shouldn't get a little bit better about the way they're talking. That's the small stuff. The big stuff is policies. where if you don't do what you're told to do or what the law is, they come get you, and they have guns and stuff. And Eric Gardner, the guy who's often cited because he was selling cigarettes by the cigarette in New York City, of course, because cigarettes are so expensive. There's a law against that. And the police were arresting him. And he did sort of resist in that he wasn't really going along. He was a big guy and so on. They did a chokehold. They shouldn't have done a chokehold. The police should have done better. But why did we create this conflict to begin with? Why are there police in New York City? Several of them, a bunch of them. The money they spent just to be there for the time it took for them to wrestle him and then kill him. I don't think they wanted to kill him, but they killed him. Why is that? Why are we? Because it's we who have allowed it to happen at the very least. Not to blame the wrong people. We didn't make it happen, but we allowed it to. Why are we so shocked? Why are we so sure that we can fine-tune the police enough that they wouldn't use too much force in any situation, so that we can go and try to, pass laws about whether someone's selling a cigarette to someone else on the street? Less laws, more understanding of our limits, more respect for other people and their views that are just sometimes different than our views. And no one's arguing for let evil things happen to people, let people do harm to other people. But it starts in understanding political rights. And I think that self-determination, we should take it just as far as we can go in every direction. But instead, maybe we should take what's really been taken as far as it can go in every direction, Tim. And that is nepotism. Nepotism today, nepotism tomorrow, nepotism forever. And I don't know how much, frankly, and usually I think I'm smart, so I think I have some idea of how some story affected the political voting and, the voting in Iowa. How much did the impeachment and all this talk about Hunter Biden and Ukraine, how much did that hurt Biden? And I really don't have any sense of that. Partly because Biden is not a good candidate. And you think about, Trump said something that could be true. He said, I think Joe has lost his fastball. But the problem is that might not be quite true. And of course, if there were a fact check, Trump would get lie, for this. But I'm not sure Joe ever had his fastball. And so if he didn't have a fastball, he couldn't have lost it. And that's another lie by Donald J. Trump, the president of the United States. So it's, I do think it hurt in the same way that after the election in 2016, I remember Chuck Todd, not my favorite newsman, who admitted that the media missed how unpopular Hillary Clinton was and how much people didn't trust her. And you think about, you got all these polls. I'll bet Chuck Todd had access to more polling than I had. I knew that. And I didn't just knew it because I felt it instinctively myself, because I'm a somewhat normal person, but because I saw it in the polling. I saw it very strongly in the polling. And so how did he miss it? And how did the entire media corps miss it? Well, I think they missed it because they're creating a narrative for the rest of us to live in. And that wasn't part of the narrative. It didn't fit the narrative. And it is possible, like if there's a major disease like the coronavirus or something else that takes over the world, or an asteroid hits us or something, that will push, gun control off the front page, or whatever the issue du jour is of the national media narrative creators. But they like to create a narrative. And anyway, when you look at this whole thing with impeachment and Biden, part of the narrative in the media has been there's no evidence that Biden has done that this whole story's been debunked. And of course, Lindsey Graham, not my favorite senator, said at one point, who debunked it? What's happened is that the media basically said it didn't exist. And so it's never really looked into it. Now, it is true that there is no smoking gun that some court said he did this, or that there was an investigation and they found a tape that had him saying, yes, this was a payoff. But at the very least, Hunter Biden earning more than $1 million from an oil company, energy company in the Ukraine that was thought to be by our deep state experts, probably all 17, or I don't know, we may have 1,700, deep state intelligence agencies today. And they all, looked at that and said, this is a corrupt company. Hunter Biden goes to work for them, knowing nothing about the issue at hand, which is energy, and is making more than $1 million. His father, as vice president, is running is the main policy guy for the Obama administration on Ukraine. That is a problem. And the problem isn't Hunter Biden. Hunter Biden, maybe we missed it. And he went in, he just said, look, I'm going to take a shot. That's what life is about. I'm going to take a shot. I'm going to go and I'm going to interview. I'm going to find a way to get into Burisma. And man, I am going to so wow them in the interview that they just say, this guy, I mean, look, there was oil before, but now there's Hunter Biden. And we got to get this guy. We get this guy, the sky's the limit. So he goes in, he wows them in the interview, and they say, look, we kind of look at this with him and the vice president. That's a little dicey, but we can't give up his expertise. This guy leads us to the future. And so they give the job to Hunter Biden. Well, he has every right to take that job. Every right. Let's not stand in the way of people for some political motivation. And so what do? Simple. Mr. Obama, the Obama administration realizes the problem, because if you're talking about corruption, if you believe in campaign finance reform like all these guys spout out, then you know that this is a huge conflict of interest. You recognize that right off the bat. Anybody would. A 2-year-old would. If you don't, something's wrong with you and you ought not to be involved in any ethics legislation or anything else. So you know this is a problem, and you say simply to not Hunter, because Hunter doesn't work for you. Hunter doesn't work for us, the American people. Joe does. This is Joe's failing. And this is Obama's failing as the chief executive. Hunter Biden may have done all kinds of wrong things, from not paying child support to some kid he fathered in Arkansas, to drugs and everything else, which I don't think should be a crime. Probably wasn't a good idea for him personally. But whatever Hunter did, whatever type of person he is, this is not his problem. This is our problem, and this is Joe Biden's problem. Joe Biden should have said, Mr. President, I'm sorry to inform you, but my son has taken a great job offer he got from Burisma. And I'm so excited for him personally, but I recognize we cannot have me running Ukrainian policy, being the point man, if my son works for this big oil company owned by an oligarch in the Ukraine. So that should have been, and if he didn't do that, Obama should have stepped in and said, it's my duty to step in and say, Joe, let's find you something else you can do. You can't be the point person. Now, our commentary wasn't on Hunter Biden. It was on Chelsea Clinton. Because while all of what I said I think is important, maybe we need to write one on that, Tim. I should scribble those, get those notes, would you? But anyway, but we made the point that there's all this focus there. But here's another thing, and it doesn't have quite the same conflict of interest, but it still has a conflict of interest. And in the sense that it's more subtle, people might miss it. Hillary Clinton is has had all these corporate board positions. And of course, it's been said that she's made all this money as if they're paying her millions, that she made $9 million from corporate board position in the last few years. And she made all that money from NBC for a role that just didn't seem to really justify that money. But look, they're free to do what they want to do. But there is a conflict of interest there. If then NBC is covering Hillary Clinton, it's to me that they have a problem. They either look like they are too nice because they have this entangling relationship with her daughter, or maybe they're being too tough to try to look like they don't have that entangling relationship. It seems to me to be fraught with danger, and yet, boy, they wrote a big check for someone who really never was into television, it didn't seem, and not that she was terrible, because she wasn't terrible, but she wasn't really very good either. I mean, it was just clear this isn't what she wants to do. This isn't how she sees herself. This isn't her career path. She got a bunch of money from NBC. And she's gotten a lot of money on these boards. And maybe she's a lot better at this than we think. And again, it's not our money. It's not public money. But you have to look at this society. We started talking about all the 1% and, where we constantly are bashing people who have money, but almost everybody I know who has money. And frankly, I'm getting to an age in which I realize, when I was younger, I kind of would say, well, I don't think I'm ever going to be rich, but it could have happened. I still had that hope in the back of my head. And, I'd stumble and fall down and there'd be a lottery ticket or something, Willy Wonka would bring me to his factory, and I'd be the nicest guy. Anyway, it's always possible. Well, I'm getting to the age where I'm starting to kind of doubt that I'm going to become just a multi-billionaire. My whole experience with people who have money is that, of course, there's going to be a certain percentage who are jerks, just like there's a certain percentage of almost any demographic group you can find that are jerks. And the funny thing is, we might disagree about who the jerks are. That's how crazy this world is. But by and large, out of all the demographic groups I know, wealthy people are harder working, more community conscious, more focused. They're focused on what they're doing and they get things done. And the nicest people you would ever want to bump into. And so I just think when I hear all this anti-rich people stuff, it really makes me mad. It really, it's and as we talked about earlier, it's dangerous. But what is the situation? I mean, where would these people be right to kind of say, look, it's not fair that this person has all this wealth? Well, if someone goes and works their tail off, it's fair that they make more money than the person who didn't. That's just fair. Sometimes people talk about the tax code. Oh, they don't pay their fair share. I've always thought, let's not talk about fair shares, because if we do that, rich people are going to pay less, and you and I are going to have to pay more. Where it is unfair that people make a bunch of money is when they use our resources that they don't really have a right to, and their position in our government to get connections and do different things. Years ago, when Tom Daschle from South Dakota was the Senate Majority Leader, Democrat, his wife was the chief lobbyist for American Airlines and for other groups. And of course said, look, I don't lobby my husband. But is there not just a little bit of problem that you're gonna, I mean, look, if I have a big company and I'm worried that regulation is a big deal in my industry, I'd sure like to hire the wife of the Senate president. And frankly, we can't have every law that if you're related, if you're the third cousin of some, politician, you have to be on welfare the whole time they're in office. That's not going to work either. What does work is to stop having government make the decisions about who's a winner and who's a loser. We know some of these things are wrong. We know when you give $500 million to Solyndra to do, solar panels or whatever. Look, if solar panels make sense, then let someone do it in the marketplace. Don't subsidize it. We in this country, think of how crazy people are about football or basketball or whatever. They're nuts. I know, I'm one of them. I'm nuts. We're willing to spend money. Why on earth would people who are not into that be forced to spend money so that I can do something like that? That is just insane. And we do it all over the country. It's gotten to the point where now any major billionaire who owns a sports team is an idiot if he would even think about building that stadium himself. My goodness, that's a cost of doing business you just put on the taxpayers. That, this is the sort of thing that it's crony capitalism. It's not capitalism. It's crony capitalism. It's mercantilism. That is the very thing when our ancestors, I don't know if they're actually my ancestors, but somebody's ancestors, and they were darn good people, threw that tea into the harbor. They didn't throw the tea into the harbor because it was expensive from taxes. They threw the tea in the harbor because the jerk legislators in the parliament in Great Britain wanted to force the Americans to buy that tea. They wanted to create this market that didn't have a choice to get their tea from somewhere else and had to get it from the East India Company, because the East India Company had their ends with the parliament. In the same way that too often we're doing business today, the American Revolution was a revolt against mercantilism, against crony capitalism, against what is too often at work all over our country. When you have places where if you want to go into business as a moving company and you have to get the permission of other moving companies, does that sound like a free market? Does that sound like capitalism? In the last 20, 30, 40, 50 years, used to be that occasionally, if you were a doctor, you had to be a licensed doctor. Now you can't, you have to be a license to do cornrowing of hair. Of course, white folks controlling the legislatures. We've passed all the laws that barbers have to do this and this because the barbers went to the legislature and said, hey, why don't we make it tough for anybody to compete with me so that I can charge a little bit higher rates? And then lo and behold, people are going to folks who actually know how to do their hair and getting it cornrowed and well, we can't let that happen. They've got to go to the same barber college. But of course, that barber college doesn't know how to do it. So they have to spend money to learn how to do stuff they don't want to do and not learn anything they do want to do. Why? Because it's not about safety. I mean, that's the funniest thing. It's always, this is about health and safety. There's nothing dangerous about a bad haircut. It may really stink for a few days or a few weeks until your hair grows back. Nothing dangerous. There's no public health and safety that is implicated. And yet, this is the way our economy runs. And this is the way I think folks in government want it to run, because it's the way they have the most power. And it's why people going to Congress go not wealthy, and after a few terms are wealthy. They become great stock pickers because, of course, they know what's happening in the economy because they're making a lot of the bad things happen or not doing things. And they know what they're going to do or not do. They have a better read than you and I do. And that's been shown again and again. I mean, incredible. Nobody picks stocks as well as congressmen. And they control way too much of the economy. And that's what Chelsea Clinton's doing is a little bit different, but it is illuminating the way too much of our economy has become. And it's all politics, and it's got to stop. And of course, that leads us to Thursday and the Blue Plate Special, the trifecta. And basically, we pointed out what everyone, of course, already saw. We didn't have to point it out, which was, my goodness, we've got, the Democratic Party, their first go-round in a critical election, and they are lost. They have some app that's going to run their whole thing, and apparently didn't test it or whatever. I mean, what kind of idiot did they hire? Well, they hired someone who used to work for Hillary Clinton. And there was all kinds of problems in 2016 between Bernie and Hillary in Iowa and the way that was run. No question that the DNC was pro-Hillary, anti-Sanders, and that it had an impact in that race, not just from super delegates, which are still there. Now they don't get to vote however they want until the second ballot. But the Democrats still have a bunch of super delegates. It's kind of like saying, we know it's wrong to have a king, so the king's only going to have so much power. So there was that, which is a huge problem. And then, of course, there was the fact that the media seems to, it's one thing for the Democratic Party to say, oh my goodness, we cannot run a socialist. We cannot, we're going to lose. But for the media to say, oh my goodness, Democrats, you cannot run a socialist, because if you do, you're going to lose. I mean, we're going to lose. I mean, you're going to lose. Did we say we? And we've already seen the media treat Tulsi Gabbard, who is for peace. That is not allowed. If you are against regime change wars, the media, pretty universally at the national level, is going to be against you. But this is the media against the front runner, Sanders, and I think the clear front runner at this point. Now, Buttigieg is who I've been afraid of the whole time, because he seems to love national service and is certainly comes from a family that his father was like a scholar on communist Marxist thinking and so on, and he loves the deep state. He's a big CIA guy and so on. But I think if you look over nationally, and maybe Buttigieg comes up, but right now Sanders is the front runner. And the media just constantly not covering him as a front runner. It's interesting that in essence now there's a big freak out by not only the higher ups in the Democratic Party, but apparently also in the media. And as a lot of talk show hosts I know say, the same thing. But they are concerned about a socialist running. And we kind of raised the point, my goodness, you've been pushing all of these socialistic ideas. You know, the truth is the media, I think, is to the left of the center of the Democratic Party. It may not be to the left of the leftist most Democrat, but it's close there. And so in essence, they've been beating up on the rich and creating class warfare and pushing socialism, and oh, this isn't really socialism, but with the realization that the public doesn't want what they're selling, at least to a certain degree. And so all of a sudden, after pushing all this, oh my goodness, we might get a candidate offering to really give people what we've been, in essence, promoting as the best way for the country to go. The country doesn't want to go that way, and I think it's a recognition of that. And of course, it I think leads us to our Friday commentary, because in essence, the country didn't want to go to impeachment either. And on Friday, impeachments are forever. We really picked up on the fact that Nancy Pelosi came out and said, this impeachment is forever. It's a stain on Mr. Trump. And yet, I'm not so sure it is a stain on Mr. Trump, in the sense that the public, his approval ratings are at their highest. I believe he's at his highest all-time approval rating after the days after all of this impeachment. And I have to say, I was a younger man then in the 90s when Bill Clinton was impeached. Democrats certainly fought term limits. Republicans kind of embraced it, and then in the back room tried to strangle it to death. And during all of that, I really, I wasn't a big warrior for impeachment, but I kind of thought, he did lie under oath and so on, and I didn't have a real problem with it either. I look back now and I think he did lie under oath. That's a real crime, and but I just don't know that it would have helped the country had he been impeached. And I feel the same way about the Trump impeachment. That a little different in that I don't think there would have been the lasting scar from Clinton that there would be here, because this in many ways I think is for a segment of the population their first and only president. And I think the opposition from the media and from the left has been so strong all along that you would have a segment of the public that if he were impeached and removed from office would say, "Why vote? We can't win." And of course I think maybe I'm not as sympathetic to that segment. That maybe the same thing would have happened with Clinton. But I will say this: I am now think that the impeachment of Bill Clinton was a mistake, and I'm not talking about a political mistake. Was a real mistake. We have to differentiate that, because it could be that it was the right thing to do, but politically not wise. It could be that impeaching Trump was the right thing to do, but politically unwise. But I think you have to calculate: is this going to help my country or not? Is this going to help us be better in the future or not? And if you think the answer is not, you don't have to. Just like a policeman can let somebody go if they think that busting them for that jaywalking just isn't going to help society. And I think it's the same thing here. I'm not saying it's jaywalking. That's just the crime that came to mind. But in any of these cases, we do have to make these judgment calls. But I think it also shows where our government is, that here we get through with impeachment, and the Democrats, the Republicans, well, first of all, the Democrats are talking about what a stain it is, and they're still fighting it. Trump, and I have to admit that a few of his snide, obnoxious comments were sort of funny. But what is he doing? Going to have a big to-do, and let's just keep all this fomenting. It doesn't make sense. And then, of course, it comes out that the Republicans, if they take the House, and I think that the Democrats may have misdialed their impeachment in such a way that the public will throw them out and Republicans take the House, they're going to expunge the impeachment, which means we're back into it all. And then, of course, there was some talk that if Democrats keep the House, that they would come with a new impeachment against the president. You could say they don't get it. They don't want to get it. They're not listening to us. They don't intend to listen to us. And if this isn't just an indictment of the whole shebang, I don't know what is. So what do we do? And there's, I don't, in the next 5 minutes, I'm not going to give this the solution. I'm keeping it secret. The magic solution that just solves all the world's problems. But on Friday, we talked about the impeachment process and recognized that granted, there's only been 3 impeachments in history. Andrew Johnson, who was a Democrat with Republicans in control of both houses. He took over for Lincoln, who was assassinated. He was sympathetic to the South in some ways, and there was all kinds of very nasty things going on underneath the surface and maybe above the surface. And he was saved from conviction by 1 vote. But he did not receive a single vote of his own party saying in the Senate to convict him. And Bill Clinton, in 1999, when he was impeached, the Republicans voted for impeachment, just about every one of them, but not a single Democrat in the Senate voted for impeachment. And so when you think about looking at this impeachment process we just had, which I think everyone would say, oh my goodness, it couldn't possibly get any more partisan than what we just had. 100% partisan in the House. Well, I shouldn't say 100%. Not a single Republican voting to convict him for impeachment. You did have Amash leave the Republican Party, become an independent, and vote for that. And you had a couple of Democrats who didn't vote for impeachment, but pretty much completely partisan. And then in the Senate, you had Mitt Romney being the only Republican to vote for conviction on the first count, not the second count. And of course, we pointed out, for what it's worth, that Mitt Romney is Mr. Flip-Flop. So the idea that somehow from principle, he stood on principle, Utah is a red state, can't stand Trump. I don't think this cost him anything. Utah has he won Utah, but there was a third party candidate that I believe got 20% of the vote. So Utah is not a bastion of Trump support. This did not cost Mitt Romney like it would have cost other people because of the demographics and the opinions of his state. But Mitt Romney has not had a career of principle. He's had a career of, what do the polls say I should do, and say, okay, I'll go do and say it, as well as any CEO you could hire. And then, in essence, so you have impeachment now. One Republican votes against his party's president, and that's the first ever in history. And so, of course, we've got this process that, to me, as I pointed out, I think makes a lot of sense. I mean, it is a good process to have some way to remove a president. And of course, when the Constitution was written, it wasn't like we were going to have the sort of petition recall process and then put the guy's name on the ballot as we have in a number of states and local areas where you can recall your mayor or your city council member or your governor, as they did in California years ago. And it's been my experience that there are times where a official who really, really deserves to be recalled is not recalled. I'm not aware of any case in the history of the country that a person who didn't deserve to be recalled was recalled. Now, I could be wrong, and I encourage anybody to leave any cases that we should look into. But when people deserve recall, they aren't often recalled. And when they are, boy, do they deserve it. And we need that sort of process. And if you look at impeachment, it isn't that sort of process. It's a way for partisan hacks to make mischief. It's also a way for guilty people to get away with whatever they want to get away with because they have enough votes in the Congress to get away with it. We need a process where the citizens could say, no, you're out. And it doesn't matter what the partisan makeup is. So again, this is desperately needed at all levels of government. It's not at all partisan. It's citizen-based. And I'll tell you, my biggest fear is that if Trump is defeated in 2020, that so many people who have gotten engaged in the process against him will say, problem solved, and go back to their daily lives and not think about, which I don't think they've thought about. So many people, I think, who are opposed to Trump are fixated on Trump. Almost every problem we have, even if it's a problem that Trump is exacerbating, was a problem before. When you think of, I think, what has made people the most livid, and maybe myself too, is some of the things in terms of immigration and at the border and kids in cages and so on. And Obama was doing that. And some of the raids that, and not that you couldn't raid, there's a law written, there's a process for us to get that law undone. I recognize that the law says they can go and have raids and arrest people who aren't documented. But I think you have to do these things, again, in a way that respects other people's human rights. I think we need a policy that makes some sense instead of a stupid policy. In other words, almost everything that's happening is one side trying to score political points and the other side trying to score political points and using both the DACA kids, some of whom are as old as we are, and the anti-immigration people who are concerned that the hordes are taking over our country, Both of those groups are being played, and they're being played for other people's political gain. That's how the whole system works. That's why our economy can't be a free market economy, because they're too busy playing us for certain people to win at our expense, and across the board. And I think what we learned this week is that they aren't tired of impeachment. Neither side is tired of the BS. Trump, I've never in my life liked people using obnoxious language. Sometimes you walk into a 7-Eleven or something, and someone is talking using filthy language. I hate that. I don't like our society being coarsened, and I don't consider myself a prude, but I just don't like people using bad language. But the President of the United States, I think for the first time, openly said BS with all the letters and all the sounds put together. And I think that actually connected with a large number of Americans. It would have connected with Americans against Trump, except Trump said it, because that's what our government has become at just about every level, especially in Washington. The problem is, when Trump said that, I don't think he's committed to ending that. And we know darn good and well on both sides of the aisle in the Congress, they are committed to keeping it going. And you can argue, if you're a Republican, hey, we didn't bring this. But I think I'm arguing that if things had been reversed, you sure as heck might have brought it. And the Democrats are going to keep pushing this, and the Republicans are going to keep pushing this. And it just is, again, what it suggests is we've got to do stuff outside of elect somebody who's going to take us home. I constantly think I want the troops to come home. Nobody's going to do this for us. Nobody's going to do it for us. And so we end another week, Tim, knowing that we need a movement beyond the movements we have. And I see great stuff happen at the grassroots all the time. But it needs to be built into a national movement that can transcend some of the ridiculous partisanship, and that has respect for basic freedoms. And that I think is possible, but we need a movement like that. It's not gonna come out of the Republican and Democratic parties. I think that is pretty darn obvious.
Well, that's certainly a good place to stop and sign off for the weekend. Though I do think that maybe you should explain what the Republicans are doing to keep impeachment going by trying to annul it, basically. What they call it? Expunge it?
Yes, expunge it. Like sometimes, if you're a kid, you get convicted of something, and they expunge your record if you don't, especially driving records. This was the way, but also with other, sometimes minor crimes, minor possession of alcohol, something like that, they'll expunge it from your record, or traffic ticket if you don't get another ticket in a certain period of time. So if Republicans win the House, they've said they're going to go expunge Trump's record. It's just too much. And they think that they're fighting over, who has some right to brag or whatever. But the American people are so sick and tired of all these folks. There's no right to brag to anybody. Anyway, it's just the lack of vision is blinding.
Thank you for joining us for This Week in Common Sense. I'm Timothy Verkula. You can reach me at Workman. That's Workman with an I, not an O, on social media. And Paul Jacob can be found at thisiscommonsense.com and on the weekends on SoundCloud and YouTube.